Her dog appears every day carrying sticks, but when they discover the reason, Mrs. Martha watched from her living room window, intrigued by the punctuality of that golden retriever who passed by her house every morning. The animal, with its shiny golden coat, walked determinedly along the cobblestone sidewalk of the small neighborhood in Asheville, always carrying a stick in its mouth, as if fulfilling an important mission. "That's the 5th time this week," she murmured to herself, adjusting her glasses on her wrinkled face. "Always at the same time, always with those sticks." At 72, widowed for 6 years, Martha found in life's little mysteries a way to fill her days. Since Richard had passed, the house on Maple Street felt too big, too quiet. Her retirement as an elementary school teacher ensured she could live comfortably, but it didn't fill the emptiness of the hours. On that May morning, as winter began to show its first signs in the Blue Ridge Mountains, she decided it was time to satisfy her curiosity. She draped a wool coat over her shoulders, grabbed her cane, more out of precaution than necessity, and stepped out, determined to follow the mysterious animal. The dog was already turning the corner as she closed the gate. Moving briskly for her age, Martha kept a safe distance, watching the golden retriever march on with purpose, weaving past the occasional pedestrian who smiled at the sight of the dog so focused on its task. After about 15 minutes, the dog entered a more wooded area, part of a small municipal reserve that ran through the neighborhood. A dirt path followed a narrow creek, and the animal followed it until it reached a clearing with a weathered wooden bench. There, to Martha's surprise, was a neat pile of sticks, forming what looked like the beginnings of a structure. The golden retriever carefully placed its stick on top of the others, nudged it into place with its snout, and stood still for a moment, as if admiring its work. Then it turned and trotted off in another direction. Curious, Martha approached the pile of sticks. It didn't look like an accident. The sticks were arranged as if they were the pillars of a small construction. As she examined the curious structure, she heard a voice behind her. "He does this every day, you know." Martha turned, startled. An elderly man, perhaps a few years older than her, leaned on a dark wooden cane. His white hair was neatly combed back, and he wore a wool sweater over a dress shirt despite the casual setting. "Do you know this dog?" she asked. "I do. In fact, he's mine," the man replied with a faint smile. "My name is Robert Anderson. And you, if I may, ask we're following my dog." Martha felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Martha Williams, and yes, I confess I was curious. He passes by my house every morning, always with a stick, always at the same time." Robert stepped closer to the bench and gestured for her to sit if she wished. After a moment's hesitation, Martha accepted the invitation. "Duke," said Robert. "His name is Duke, and he's been doing this for nearly a year now." "A year?" Martha glanced at the pile of sticks. "And why is he building whatever this is?" Robert fell silent for a moment, his gaze drifting to the small creek ahead. "It's a long story," he said finally. "And I'm not sure you'd want to hear it." "I've got all the time in the world, Mr. Robert," Martha replied, with a gentle smile. "And I confess I'm even more curious now." Robert sighed, looking at the stick construction. "Duke isn't building something, Mrs. Martha. He's rebuilding." And so, as the morning unfolded under the sky of Asheville, Robert began to tell the story behind the dog that appeared every day carrying twigs. 5 years earlier, Robert had retired as a civil engineer after 4 decades working on projects across the United States. A widower with his only daughter living abroad, he had chosen Asheville to spend his retirement years, drawn by the mild climate and the tranquility of the mountain town. The house he bought was near the small reserve, allowing him to take daily walks, his greatest pleasure since moving there. It was during one of these walks that he found Duke, still a puppy, abandoned near the creek, soaked and shivering from the cold. "I'm not one to believe in fate, Mrs. Martha, but that day I had changed my usual route," said Robert, his eyes moist. "If I hadn't taken a different path, maybe Duke wouldn't be here today." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Robert took the puppy home, dried him off, fed him, and after checking for a collar or microchip, decided to adopt him. Duke became his constant companion, bringing new life to the retired engineer's lonely routine. For the first 2 years, Robert and Duke explored every corner of the small reserve. It was the dog who led him to the clearing with the bench, a spot that became their favorite. There, Robert would read while Duke ran and played around. "It was in that clearing that I met Eleanor," Robert said, his voice softer. "She brought her grandson to play in the reserve every Sunday. Eleanor was a widow like me, 68 years old, living with her daughter, son-in-law, and 7-year-old grandson, Tommy. The boy adored Duke, and soon their Sunday outings became a commitment for all 4 of them. As the months passed, Robert and Eleanor developed a friendship that slowly blossomed into something more. It wasn't a fiery young romance, but a deep connection, built on mutual understanding and companionship. "You know that feeling of finding someone who seems to know your soul?" Robert asked, looking at Martha. "That's how it was with Eleanor. We understood each other without needing many words." Martha's expression softened. She knew that feeling well. It had been that way with Richard for over 4 decades. Robert continued his story. On the 3rd anniversary of their meeting, he took Eleanor to the clearing. Duke ran happily around them, as always. Robert had planned everything: a small picnic, music from an old portable radio, and a special surprise. "I built a little bridge over the creek near here," he said, pointing to a path between the trees. "Eleanor always complained that we couldn't explore the other side because the creek, though narrow, was too deep to cross safely. The bridge was simple but sturdy. Robert had used his engineering skills to make sure it was safe. Eleanor was delighted with the gift. She said it was the most romantic gesture anyone had ever done for her," he remarked with a melancholic smile. "We called it our bridge, and it became a symbol of what we were building together." Happiness, however, didn't last as long as they'd hoped. 6 months later, Eleanor began forgetting small things: where she'd left her keys, scheduled appointments, names of acquaintances. At first, they blamed it on fatigue or age, but the memory lapses became more frequent and severe. "The diagnosis hit like a blow," Robert said, his voice trembling. "Early-stage Alzheimer's. The doctors were clear about the prognosis. The disease would progress. It was only a matter of time." Determined to make the most of the time they had, Robert and Eleanor cherished their moments together even more. He recorded everything in a diary and in photographs, knowing that one day those memories would be important. "Eleanor loved our bridge. Even on days when she was confused, going there seemed to bring her some clarity," explained Robert. "She said it was our special place where memories were safe." A year after the diagnosis, Eleanor's family decided it would be best for her to move to New York, where her daughter had access to more advanced treatments. The farewell was painful, but Robert promised to stay in touch and visit whenever possible. "Our last walk was to the bridge," he said, his voice trembling. "Eleanor was having a good day. She remembered almost everything. We promised each other that no matter what happened, that place would hold our story." After Eleanor left, Robert continued his daily walks with Duke, always including a visit to the bridge. 3 months later, a severe storm hit the area. Heavy rains caused minor flooding and damage in several parts of town. "When the storm passed, I went to check on our bridge," Robert continued. "It was completely destroyed. The current had swept everything away, leaving nothing but a few pieces of wood stuck to the banks." To Robert, the destruction of the bridge felt like an omen. That same week, he received news that Eleanor's condition had worsened significantly. She no longer recognized her own daughter and rarely had moments of clarity. "I tried to rebuild the bridge," he said, looking at his wrinkled hands. "But it's not as simple as it used to be. Age comes for us all, and my hands aren't as steady anymore." Then Duke began his strange behavior. One day, Robert saw him pick up a stick in the garden and carry it to the clearing. The next day, the dog repeated the gesture, and the day after, and the day after that. "At first I thought it was just play," Robert said with a faint smile, "but then I realized he was placing the sticks exactly where the bridge used to start. Over time, Duke's behavior became a routine. Every morning he'd go out alone, find a stick, and bring it to the clearing, carefully placing it with the others. It's like he's trying to rebuild the bridge in his own way," Robert explained, his voice thick with emotion. "As if he understands what that place means to me, to us. Mrs. Martha looked at the pile of sticks with new eyes. It wasn't just a random collection of wood. It was an attempt to preserve something precious, to keep an important memory alive. "Eleanor is still Mrs.?" Martha hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. "Yes, she's still alive," Robert replied, understanding the unspoken question. "But she doesn't recognize me anymore. The last few times I visited, she looked at me as if I were a complete stranger." Robert wiped away a quiet tear. "I still visit her once a month. I bring photos, tell her stories about our bridge, about Duke. The doctors say even if she doesn't consciously remember, something inside her might recognize the familiarity." Mrs. Martha felt a lump in her throat. There was so much devotion in this man's words, so much love persisting despite the circumstances. "What do you plan to do with these sticks?" she asked after a moment of silence. Robert looked at the unfinished construction. "Honestly, I don't know. I let Duke keep going because it seems important to him. Maybe it's his way of processing her absence. Animals understand more than we think." A thought occurred to Mrs. Martha. "Have you ever considered rebuilding the bridge for real?" Robert looked at her, surprised. "Alone? No, I couldn't. Besides my age, I'd need materials, tools." "Not alone," Mrs. Martha interrupted, feeling an enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years. "I could help. And I'm sure other people in the neighborhood would help too if they knew the story." Robert's expression was a mix of surprise and skepticism. "You barely know me, Mrs. Martha. Why would you get involved in this?" Martha smiled, thinking how to explain. Since Richard had passed, she had withdrawn more and more, turning down invitations from neighbors, avoiding involvement in the community. Following Duke that morning had been her first genuine spark of curiosity in a long time. "Because sometimes we need projects bigger than ourselves," she finally replied. "And your story, Eleanor's story, deserves to keep being told." On that worn wooden bench, watching the pile of sticks a loyal dog had gathered day after day, an unlikely friendship was born, and with it, the seed of something that would change not just Martha and Robert's lives, but the entire small neighborhood in Asheville. In the weeks that followed, Martha became a constant presence in Robert and Duke's lives. Together, they developed a plan to rebuild the bridge. Robert, with his engineering experience, drew up a simple but sturdy design. Martha, with her community connections after decades as a teacher, began rallying support. The first to join them was old Joe, a retired carpenter who lived 3 houses down from Martha. When he heard the story of the bridge and Eleanor, he not only offered to help, but also to provide some of the needed lumber. "I've got a shed full of good material I'm not using anymore," he said during his first visit to the clearing. "Better, it'd serve a noble purpose than gather dust." Betty, who ran the neighborhood grocery store, promised to provide snacks and drinks for the volunteers once work began. Young Brian, the grandson of one of Martha's former colleagues and an architecture student, offered to assist with technical aspects of the project. In just over a month, what had started as an impulsive idea had turned into a community effort. Everyone who heard the story of Eleanor, Robert, and Duke felt moved and wanted to contribute in some way. For Robert, this outpouring of support was astonishing. Since moving to Asheville, he'd lived quietly with few friends besides Eleanor. Now his living room often hosted meetings where neighbors discussed reconstruction details. "I never imagined so many people would care," he confessed to Martha one afternoon as they watched Duke play in the yard. "It's like Eleanor, even, though she's gone, is still bringing people together." Martha smiled, noticing how Robert's face lit up when he spoke of his partner. It was clear that despite the disease that had stolen her memories, their love remained untouched. "The best love stories are the ones that keep echoing, even when the people are no longer here," she said, thinking of Richard too. As preparations progressed, Martha began noticing changes in herself. The constant weariness she'd felt since her husband's passing had eased. Now she woke up excited, eager to check on the project's progress or visit Robert and Duke. Her daughter Jennifer, who lived in San Diego and usually called once a week, noticed the difference in her mother's voice. "You sound lighter, Mom," she remarked during one of their phone calls. "This bridge project is doing you good." Martha couldn't deny it. Getting involved in Duke and his sticks had given her life new purpose. It wasn't just about rebuilding a physical structure, it was about reconnecting with the community, about honoring precious memories. The big day for the start of reconstruction was set for a sunny Saturday in July. The forecast promised perfect weather for outdoor work. The night before, Martha could barely sleep. Her anticipation was so great. When she arrived at the clearing the next morning, she was moved by what she saw. More than 20 people had shown up of all ages, from young children who would help with simple tasks to elders like Old Joe, whose experience would be invaluable. Robert was at the center of the group, explaining the work plan with Duke sitting faithfully by his side. When he saw Martha, the dog ran to her, wagging his tail happily, as if understanding she was an important ally in his mission. "He really likes you," Robert remarked as he approached. "Duke has a good sense about people." Martha stroked the dog's head, touched by this display of affection. The work began shortly after a brief ceremony, where Robert shared the story of the original bridge and what it had meant to him and Eleanor. There wasn't a dry eye in the clearing when he finished his account, explaining how Duke had started collecting twigs after the bridge was destroyed. "I believe that somehow he understood what that place meant to us," Robert concluded, and he decided in his own way to preserve that memory. Tasks were assigned according to each volunteer's skills. Old Joe oversaw the wood preparation, instructing the younger ones on how to sand and treat each piece properly. Brian supervised the measurements and alignment of the structure. Martha, in turn, organized the groups, making sure everyone stayed busy and well-fed, thanks to the snacks provided by Betty. Duke watched everything with interest, occasionally bringing a new twig to add to his pile, as if wanting to contribute in his own way. The children, enchanted by the dog, created a game where they helped Duke find suitable twigs. By the end of that first day, the main pillars of the bridge were already in place. It was just the beginning, but everyone could already picture the finished structure. Fatigue was evident on the volunteers' faces, but there was also undeniable satisfaction. "It was an excellent start," Robert told Martha, as they watched the sun set over the creek. "Thanks to you." Martha shook her head, refusing the credit. "It was thanks to Duke," she corrected. "If he hadn't started building his twig bridge, none of this would be happening." Over the following weeks, work continued on weekends and some afternoons, depending on the volunteers' availability. What had initially seemed like a simple project turned out to be more complex than expected, especially since Robert insisted on building something durable, something that would withstand future storms. "I don't just want it to be pretty," he explained. "I want it to last, to be here for a long time telling our story." By mid-August, when the bridge was nearly finished, Robert received a call that shook him deeply. Eleanor's condition had worsened, and the doctors held little hope. His daughter suggested that if he wanted to say goodbye, he should go to New York as soon as possible. When Robert shared the news with Martha, she saw the fear in his eyes, the dread of a final farewell. "You need to go," she said, holding his trembling hands, "and we'll finish the bridge while you're away. When you return, it'll be ready for the dedication. But if Eleanor—" Robert couldn't finish the sentence. "Then the bridge will be a place where you can always connect with your memories," Martha replied gently. "A symbol of the love you shared." Robert left the next morning, leaving Duke in Martha's care. The dog, sensing his owner's absence, seemed restless, but continued his daily routine of collecting a twig and carrying it to the construction site. During Robert's absence, the community redoubled their efforts to complete the bridge. What had started as a small project had become a shared mission. People who didn't even know Robert or Eleanor personally had heard the story and wanted to contribute. An elderly woman who had lived in seclusion for years after losing her husband began appearing in the clearing, bringing homemade treats for the workers. A group of teenagers, initially dragged there by their parents, became so involved that they created a social media page documenting the bridge's progress. The bridge, which was originally meant to be a simple structure, gained thoughtful details. Artistically carved railings by Old Joe, a small bench in the middle where visitors could sit and contemplate the creek, and even a waterproof box where people could leave messages or stories about special moments they had experienced there. News of the bridge even reached the Asheville City Hall. The Secretary of the Environment, impressed by the community initiative, arranged for an official plaque designating the area as Memory Bridge and ensuring its protection as part of the local heritage. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Robert stayed in New York for nearly 2 weeks. The updates he sent to Martha were bittersweet. Eleanor had good and bad days, sometimes recognizing him briefly, other times completely unaware of his presence. Yesterday, she held my hand and smiled, he wrote in a message. She didn't say anything, but her eyes, for a moment, Martha, they were truly her eyes looking right at me. The bridge was completed 3 days before Robert's scheduled return. It was a stunning structure, far beyond what anyone had initially imagined, solid, safe, and yet delicate in its details. A true labor of community love. The night before Robert's return, Martha went to the clearing with Duke. The dog seemed to sense something important was about to happen. Instead of leaving his daily stick in the usual pile, he carried it across the newly built bridge, as if testing its sturdiness, before carefully placing it in the center. Martha couldn't hold back her tears witnessing that gesture. To her, it was as if Duke was giving his final approval, completing the mission he had started alone so many months earlier. When Robert returned, the entire community gathered in the clearing for a small dedication ceremony. Seeing the finished bridge, he was speechless, too moved to express what he felt. Duke, who had been restless all morning as if sensing his owner's return, ran to Robert as soon as he saw him, jumping and barking with joy. Then, as if wanting to show off his work, the dog picked up a stick and walked onto the bridge, looking back to make sure Robert followed. "He wants you to cross," Martha said, her voice trembling. "The bridge has been waiting for you for so long." Robert walked slowly to the bridge's entrance, where Duke waited patiently. Each step seemed laden with meaning. When he reached the center where the small bench stood, he sat down with Duke immediately settling at his feet. The community watched in respectful silence as Robert took in everything that had been created in his absence. The bridge was far more than he could have ever imagined when he first shared his story with Martha that May morning. "Eleanor would have loved this," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said bridges are powerful symbols because they connect people, places, and moments." The small ceremony that followed was simple but deeply meaningful. Each person who had contributed to the bridge placed a flower at its entrance. Old Joe presented Robert with a carved wooden plaque bearing the names of Eleanor and Robert, which would be placed at the center of the bridge. "So that everyone who passes by here may know its story," explained the old carpenter. Martha in turn handed Robert an album with photographs documenting the entire construction process, from Duke's original pile of sticks to the final product. "So you can show Eleanor," she said. "Even if she doesn't fully understand, perhaps some part of her will recognize its meaning." After the ceremony, once most attendees had left, Robert and Martha remained seated on the central bench of the bridge with Duke lying between them. "How is she?" Martha finally asked, referring to Eleanor. Robert sighed, gazing at the creek flowing gently beneath them. "The disease has progressed a lot," he replied. "The doctors say she may have a few months left, a year at most." Martha gently squeezed Robert's hand. "And how are you?" Robert was silent for a moment, considering the question. "It's strange," he said at last. "There's a constant ache in knowing she's fading, that soon she won't be here anymore. But at the same time, there's immense gratitude for the time we've had, for the memories we built." He looked at the bridge, at its careful details, at the love evident in every element. "And now there's this. Something that started as a gesture from a faithful dog turned into, well, something extraordinary." Duke, as if understanding they were speaking of him, lifted his head and looked at them before standing up to fetch another stick to add to his collection at the center of the bridge. "I don't think he'll stop any time soon," Martha remarked with a smile. "I hope not," Robert replied. "Every stick is like a new memory being preserved." In the weeks that followed, Memory Bridge became a gathering place for the community. Families had picnics nearby, children played in the creek under their parents' watch, and elderly residents sat on the central bench to chat and enjoy nature. Robert visited daily, always accompanied by Duke. The dog kept his ritual, but now, instead of leaving sticks in a pile, he carefully placed them along the bridge as if decorating it. Martha often joined them. The friendship between her and Robert had deepened, built on mutual understanding and respect. Both had experienced great love in their lives and understood the pain of impending loss. In September, Robert made another trip to New York. This time he took the photo album of the bridge's construction and several larger prints to hang in Eleanor's room. When he returned, he told Martha it had been a bittersweet visit. "She didn't recognize me, not even for a moment," he said, as they walked through the reserve. But when I showed her the pictures of the bridge, something shifted in her eyes. She touched the images with her fingers, as if trying to connect with them. "The doctors say that even when conscious memory fails, something deeper remains," Martha commented. "Maybe she doesn't remember intellectually, but she feels emotionally." Robert nodded, wanting to believe in that possibility. "A nurse told me that after I left, Eleanor took one of the photos, the one of Duke with his stick on the bridge, and held onto it for hours. I don't know what it means, but I want to believe that somehow she understands." As fall deepened, turning the leaves into gold and red, the routine of Robert, Martha, and Duke settled into comfort. Their visits to the bridge were moments of reflection and peace, but also of celebrating the new friendships and connections that had formed. The story of the bridge had inspired other community projects in the neighborhood. A group of residents began restoring an abandoned playground. Others organized a shared garden system. It was as if the small community had rediscovered the value of collaboration and unity around common goals. On a particularly beautiful October afternoon, as Robert and Martha sat talking on the bridge, watching Duke play with some nearby children, Robert received a call that would once again change the course of their lives. It was Eleanor's daughter, informing him that her mother's condition had worsened significantly. The doctors had been clear. These were the final stages of the disease. "I need to go," Robert said to Martha after hanging up. "Immediately." "You shouldn't drive in this state," Martha replied, noticing how his hands trembled. "Let me call a taxi to the bus station." While Robert hurriedly gathered a few things at home, Martha arranged everything for his trip. Duke, sensing the commotion, grew restless, following Robert from room to room. "I can't take you this time, buddy," Robert said, kneeling to hug the dog. "I need you to stay with Martha and keep watching over our bridge." When it was time to leave, Duke refused to stay behind. He planted himself in front of the door, barking insistently. "Robert, maybe—" Martha began. "No, Martha, a hospital is no place for a dog," Robert interrupted. "Please take care of him for me." With a heavy heart, Martha held Duke by the leash as Robert got into the taxi. The dog barked and pulled, trying to follow the departing car. That night, Duke refused to eat. He sat by the door, as if expecting Robert to return at any moment. Worried, Martha tried to distract him with games and treats, but nothing worked. The next morning, when Martha opened the door to fetch the newspaper, Duke slipped out, running down the street before she could stop him. Her heart raced with worry. Duke knew his way home. But what if he tried to find Robert? What if he got lost? Grabbing her cane, Martha went after the dog but couldn't catch up. She decided to check the places Duke usually frequented. First Robert's house, then the clearing. It was on the bridge that she found him. The dog sat motionless at the center, staring at the water as if waiting for something. Beside him lay a stick larger than usual. "Duke, you scared me," Martha said, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. "Let's go home, sweetheart." The dog looked at her but didn't move. He seemed determined to stay there, as if standing guard. Realizing it would be useless to force him, Martha sat beside him on the bench. Duke rested his head in her lap, letting out a soft whimper. "You feel something important is happening too, don't you?" she murmured, stroking his ears. "You've always known more than the rest of us." They stayed like that for hours, the elderly woman and the loyal dog, connected by their love for Robert and through him for Eleanor. When the sun began to set, Duke finally stood up, picked up his stick, and walked slowly back home with Martha by his side. Robert's call came late that night. Eleanor had passed peacefully in her sleep. He would be in New York for a few more days for the funeral and to help her daughter with the necessary arrangements. "I'm so sorry, Robert," Martha said, tears in her eyes. So deeply. In her last hours, there was a peace in her I hadn't seen in a long time, Robert replied, his voice weary but calm. "And you know what's strange, Martha? She was holding that photo of Duke on the bridge, until the end." After a moment of silence, he asked, "How's Duke?" Martha told him about the dog's behavior, his escape, the hours on the bridge. He knew, Robert concluded. Somehow he sensed it. When Robert returned a week later, the community gathered once more on the bridge, this time for a ceremony in memory of Eleanor. It wasn't a somber event, but a celebration of the life of a woman who, despite never having lived in that neighborhood, had touched so many hearts through her story. Duke, who had remained quiet and introspective during Robert's absence, came back with all his energy when his owner returned. On the day of the ceremony, the dog carried not one but 3 sticks to the bridge, carefully placing them at the center, before solemnly sitting beside Robert. The ceremony was simple but moving. People who had never met Eleanor shared thoughts about how her story had impacted their lives, about how the bridge had transformed the community. At the end, Robert placed a small urn containing some of Eleanor's ashes in a special cavity that old Joe had created in the central bench of the bridge. "So part of her will always be here, in the place that meant so much to us," Robert explained, his voice steady despite the tears. The months that followed were a time of adjustment for Robert. The loss of Eleanor, even though expected, left a void that seemed impossible to fill. But Duke's constant presence, Mrs. Martha's friendship, and the support of the community that had formed around the bridge helped him find a new balance. Duke continued his daily ritual of bringing sticks to the bridge, though less frequently, now. It was as if, having fulfilled his main mission, he could relax a little. Mrs. Martha, in turn, discovered a new purpose in her life. Inspired by Duke's story, she began organizing visits by therapy dogs to nursing homes and hospitals in the area, seeing how the connection with animals could bring comfort and joy to people in difficult situations. Robert, still processing his loss, found solace in documenting the bridge's history. He began writing a book, recounting everything from meeting Duke to the community's construction efforts. The writing process was therapeutic, allowing him to relive precious memories while creating something lasting to honor Eleanor's memory. A year after the bridge's inauguration, the community organized a special celebration. Memory Bridge had become a local symbol, attracting visitors from other parts of town and even tourists who had heard about its unique story. During the celebration, Robert announced a surprise. With the help of Mrs. Martha and other residents, he had created the Memory Bridge Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to community projects and supporting Alzheimer's research. "From something sad, something beautiful was born," he said in his speech to the gathered community. "And that's what Eleanor would have wanted, for us to turn pain into purpose, loss into connection." Duke, now 7 years old, remained a constant presence in the neighborhood's life. Everyone knew him and treated him with special affection, aware of the crucial role he had played in the bridge's story. One day, while passing by a pet store, Robert and Mrs. Martha saw a small golden retriever puppy, the last of a litter, who seemed out of place among her more energetic siblings. "She reminds me of Duke when he was a puppy," Robert remarked, watching as the little dog observed everything with attentive, curious eyes. That same intelligence behind the gaze. Mrs. Martha smiled, an idea forming in her mind. No, Duke isn't so young anymore. Maybe he'd appreciate some company. Someone to carry on his legacy in a way." Robert looked at Mrs. Martha, surprised. "You think so?" That afternoon, they returned home with Daisy, the newest member of the family. Duke, initially cautious, soon took on the role of mentor, guiding the puppy along the paths he knew so well. To Robert and Mrs. Martha's delight, it didn't take long for Daisy to start imitating Duke, picking up small sticks and following him to the bridge. The older dog looked proud, as if passing down important knowledge to the next generation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Life went on in the quiet neighborhood of Asheville. Memory. Bridge remained a silent testament to love, loss, and new beginnings. People came from far and wide to hear its story and to see Duke, the dog who had started it all with his collection of sticks. Robert and Martha developed a special bond over the years. It wasn't a romance in the traditional sense. Both carried their great loves in their hearts, but a partnership built on mutual understanding, respect, and genuine affection. Together, they expanded the Foundation's projects, creating animal-assisted therapy programs, support groups for families of those with Alzheimer's, and initiatives to preserve local community memories. Duke aged with dignity, still keeping up his ritual of occasionally bringing a stick to the bridge, though his steps were slower. Daisy, in turn, became his faithful shadow, learning every one of his habits. On a fall afternoon, 5 years after Eleanor's passing, Robert, Martha, Duke, and Daisy walked peacefully through the reserve. The sunlight filtered through the golden leaves, casting patterns of light on the trail. When they reached the bridge, they found a surprise. Someone had left a bouquet of wildflowers on the center bench, along with a note. Robert opened it, curious. To Eleanor, Robert, and Duke. Thank you for teaching me about love and memory. When I needed it most, your story changed my life. There was no signature, just a small drawing of a bridge. Robert looked at Martha, moved. That's what remains in the end, he said softly. The stories we tell, the lives we touch, the bridges we build. Duke, as if understanding, rested his head on Robert's knee, gazing at him with those wise, gentle eyes. Daisy, mimicking the gesture, did the same with Martha. In that moment of perfect connection, under the autumn sun, with the soft sound of water flowing beneath the bridge, Robert knew one thing for certain. Some memories are too strong to be lost. Some stories keep being told, heart to heart, life to life. And as long as someone carries a stick, builds a bridge, or keeps a precious memory alive, love will always find a way to endure. That's how a simple dog, with his quiet determination to rebuild something precious, ended up rebuilding so much more. A community, 2 lonely lives, and countless hearts along the way. And Duke? Well, Duke kept at his work, stick by stick, memory by memory, building invisible bridges between past and future, loss and hope, loneliness and connection. Because some stories don't have endings, just new beginnings, new chapters, new sticks being added to the endless bridge of human memory. 3 years had passed since the inauguration of Memory Bridge. The project had inspired profound changes, not only in the quiet neighborhood of Asheville, but also in the lives of everyone involved. The foundation, created by Robert and Martha, had grown beyond their initial expectations, with branches in other cities and a nationally recognized animal-assisted therapy program. On a sunny Sunday morning, Martha flipped through a photo album on her porch, with Daisy lazily curled at her feet. The photos captured moments from the bridge's construction and the years that followed. There were pictures of Duke carrying sticks, Robert telling stories about Eleanor to children sitting in a circle in the clearing, community celebrations and small everyday victories. One photograph in particular caught her attention. Robert, sitting on the central bench of the bridge with Duke and Daisy by his side, all looking down at the creek below. There was a serenity in that image that touched Martha deeply. The tour. Sound of footsteps on the stone path interrupted her thoughts. Jennifer, her daughter, approached with a worried expression. "Good morning, Mom," she said, leaning in to kiss Martha's cheek. "How are you feeling today?" Martha smiled. Since Jennifer had temporarily moved to Asheville nearly a year ago, this question had become part of their morning routine. "I'm fine, dear. Actually, I was thinking of taking Daisy for a walk later." Jennifer sat in the chair beside her, watching her mother carefully. "Your test results came in yesterday," she said after a moment of hesitation. Dr. Johnson called. Martha closed the photo album, mentally preparing herself. 3 months earlier, during a routine checkup, The doctor had noticed concerning changes in her heart tests and recommended more specific evaluations. "And?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jennifer took her mother's hand. "You'll need surgery, Mom. It's not urgent, but it's necessary. But it's... The doctor said if we treat it now, the chances of a full recovery are excellent." Martha nodded slowly. At 75, the prospect of heart surgery was frightening, but not entirely unexpected. Her own parents had faced similar issues at the same age. "When would it be?" she asked. He suggested within a month. Enough time to prepare, but not so long that we risk waiting too much. Daisy, sensing the shift in the emotional atmosphere, stood up and rested her head on Martha's lap, looking at her with those expressive eyes that seemed to understand everything. "I'll need to tell Robert," Martha murmured, stroking the dog's ears. "He'll be worried." The relationship between Robert and Martha had deepened over the years, becoming something that transcended simple definitions. It wasn't just friendship, though mutual respect and trust were its foundation. It wasn't a conventional romance, though there was genuine love and an emotional intimacy they had both rediscovered when they least expected it. It was a partnership in the truest sense of the word. Two lives intertwined by choice, supporting each other through joys and challenges. That afternoon, as they walked together along the familiar trail leading to the bridge, Martha told Robert about the upcoming surgery. She chose a quiet moment while they watched Duke and Daisy playing near the creek. "A month, you said?" Robert asked after absorbing the news. "Yes. Dr. Johnson thinks it's ideal. Not so soon that we don't have time to prepare, but not so far that waiting would be risky." Robert nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'll be with you every step of the way, Martha. You know that, don't you?" She smiled, feeling the familiar reassurance his presence always gave her. "I know, and that's why I'm sure everything will be fine." The days that followed were filled with meticulous preparation. Jennifer, using her skills as an administrator, handled all the logistics, pre-op appointments, necessary paperwork, adjustments to the house for Martha's recovery. Robert, meanwhile, mobilized the support network they had built through the foundation. Volunteers would take turns helping with the house and the dogs during Martha's hospitalization. Amid all these preparations, a new challenge arose. Old Joe, the elderly carpenter who had been a key figure in building the bridge, was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The news struck the community like lightning, but it affected Robert particularly deeply. "It's like reliving it all over again," he confessed to Martha one evening as they dined on her porch. "Every time I look at him, I see Eleanor. I see what's coming." Martha covered his hand with hers. "But this time is different, Robert. Now you know what to expect. And Joe has something Eleanor didn't have at the beginning. An entire community ready to support him. That's how, even while preparing for her own surgery, Martha helped Robert organize a support group specifically for Joe and his family." The old carpenter, initially resistant to the idea of accepting help, finally gave in when Robert shared his personal experience with Eleanor. "It's not about you not being able to handle this alone, Joe," Robert explained during a conversation in the carpenter's workshop. "It's about letting the people who care about you be part of the journey. Believe me, I learned that the hard way. The week before the scheduled surgery, the community held a small celebration at Memory Bridge. It wasn't a somber farewell, but a positive gathering, full of shared stories and promises to reunite. Martha, though trying to stay strong, felt the weight of emotion seeing so many dear faces gathered for her sake. Old Joe, having a day of rare clarity, presented her with a special gift, a perfectly carved miniature of the bridge, with tiny figures representing Robert, Martha, Duke, and Daisy. "So you can take a little piece of this place with you to the hospital," he said, his hands slightly trembling as he handed it to her. Martha hugged her old friend, lost for words to express her gratitude. It was more than a gift. It was a symbol of everything they had built together. The night before the surgery, as she packed a small bag with essentials for the hospital, Martha found the old journal Robert had given her years ago when he helped her cope with the grief of losing Richard. On the first pages, she recognized her own shaky handwriting from the difficult days after her husband's passing. Further in, she found notes from the day she first saw Duke carrying a stick down the sidewalk. How one simple, casual observation had completely changed the course of her life. Sitting on the edge of the bed, with Daisy curled at her feet, Martha began writing a new entry. She didn't know if it was superstition or just a need to organize her thoughts, but she felt compelled to record her feelings on the eve of such a significant moment. "Tomorrow I'll entrust my heart to unfamiliar hands," she wrote. "It's a strange feeling, knowing something so intimate and vital will be exposed, handled, repaired. But then I think of everything this heart has lived through. The love for Richard, the birth of Jennifer, the pain of loss, and then this new life I found when I least expected it. I think of Robert, of Duke, of Daisy, of the bridge, of our whole community. If this heart needs mending now, it's because it has lived fully, loved deeply, felt intensely. No regrets." Closing the journal, Martha looked out the window at the starry Asheville night. There was no fear in her heart, only a strange peace. Whatever the outcome of the surgery, she knew she had lived a life worth living. The next morning, Robert arrived early to take her to the hospital. Duke and Daisy seemed to sense the importance of the moment, staying unusually well-behaved as Jennifer settled them into the car. The hospital, located in downtown Asheville, was a modern structure that contrasted with the town's historic architecture. Yet there was something comforting in its efficiency and order. At the reception desk, a surprise awaited Martha. Betty, the owner of the grocery store, was there with a small group of neighborhood residents, all holding handmade signs with messages of support and affection. "We couldn't let you go in there alone," explained Betty, handing Mrs. Martha a bouquet of wildflowers, her favorites. "We wanted you to know how many people are rooting for you." Too moved to speak, Martha simply hugged each of them, feeling an indescribable wave of gratitude. When the time finally came to proceed to pre-surgery prep, she felt wrapped in an invisible blanket of love and support. Robert walked with her as far as he was allowed, holding her hand with that calm steadiness that had become her comfort in recent years. "I'll be here when you wake up," he promised, gently kissing her forehead. "All of us will." As the medical team prepared her for surgery, Martha kept her eyes closed, visualizing Memory Bridge, Duke and Daisy running along the creek, Robert sitting on the central bench with his serene smile. These images stayed with her until the anesthesia took effect, carrying her into a deep and peaceful sleep. The surgery, which lasted nearly 6 hours, was successful. Dr. Johnson, meeting Robert and Jennifer in the waiting room, was visibly pleased with the results. "She's a strong woman," he remarked. "Her heart responded very well. Now it's a matter of patience during recovery, but I'm extremely optimistic." The days in the hospital were harder than Martha had anticipated. Post-operative pain, though, managed with medication, was a constant presence. The need to remain still for long stretches caused discomfort and frustration, but the steady presence of Robert and Jennifer, taking turns so she was never alone, made it bearable. A week after the surgery, when Martha was able to sit up and walk short distances down the hallway, Robert brought a special surprise. With special permission from the hospital, and after several calls to administration, Duke and Daisy were allowed a brief visit. Seeing the dogs, even for just 15 minutes under strict supervision, was like a breath of fresh air for Martha. Duke, now nearly 10 years old, showed clear signs of aging, his muzzle whiter, his movements slower. But his gaze remained the same, that mix of intelligence and devotion that had touched so many hearts. Daisy, meanwhile, was at the peak of her energy, held back only by the firm leash Robert kept. Her bright eyes scanned the hospital room with curiosity, finally settling on Martha with an expression that seemed to say, "We're waiting for you to come home." Recovery progressed slowly, but without complications. 2 weeks after the surgery, Martha was discharged to continue her recovery at home, under the care of a nurse who would visit daily and, of course, the constant supervision of Jennifer and Robert. Returning to her home on Maple Street was an indescribable relief. Even with the limitations imposed by post-op restrictions, no stairs, restricted movement, a controlled diet, being in her own space, surrounded by familiar things, brought unmatched comfort. Robert had prepared a surprise for her homecoming. He'd transformed the living room into a temporary bedroom with a rented hospital bed positioned so Martha could see the garden through the window. The walls were decorated with photos of the bridge and the community, and a small table beside the bed displayed the miniature carved by Old Joe. "So you feel connected to everything, even while you rest," he explained. The recovery days established a new routine for everyone. Jennifer worked remotely from her mother's house, leaving only for essential meetings. Robert came every morning, bringing Duke and Daisy for brief visits to the garden, where Martha could watch them through the window or, on good days, sitting in a chair on the porch. The community rallied in touching ways. Lunches and dinners were delivered daily, ensuring Jennifer wouldn't have to worry about cooking. Neighborhood children sent handmade drawings and cards. Even the mayor of Asheville, who had embraced the Memory Bridge project, sent flowers and a personal letter wishing her a speedy recovery. One afternoon, about a month after the surgery, when Martha could already walk longer distances with the help of a cane, Robert arrived with a serious expression that immediately worried her. "What's wrong?" she asked as soon as they were alone on the porch. Robert sat beside her, his eyes reflecting a mix of emotions. "It's Duke," he finally said. "The vet just confirmed it. He has a liver tumor, quite advanced." Martha felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Duke, the dog who had started it all, who had built both literal and metaphorical bridges in their lives. "How long?" she asked, the words nearly catching in her throat. "A few months. Maybe, Dr. Reynolds didn't want to be specific, said every case is unique." Robert ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture Martha recognized as a sign of his anxiety. "He's comfortable for now, not in pain. When that changes, we'll have to make decisions." Martha reached out, touching Robert's arm. "I'm so sorry, I know how much he means to you." Robert nodded, trying to keep his composure. 10 years. 10 years since I found him that rainy day. Feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago at the same time. Through the open window, they could see Duke and Daisy in the garden. The older dog rested in the shade of a tree, watching with attentive eyes as Daisy chased a butterfly. There were no outward signs of his condition. His behavior remained the same, though perhaps a little more lethargic than usual. "He changed so many lives," Martha murmured. "Yours, mine, a whole community's. Who would have thought a dog carrying sticks would have such an impact?" Robert wiped away a quiet tear. "You know what's most extraordinary? He's still doing it, even now, even sick. This morning, before we went to the vet, he picked up a stick in the garden and carried it all the way to the bridge. It's like he somehow knows and wants to make sure his mission is complete." That conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in their lives, one where their roles subtly reversed. Now it was Martha, still recovering, who offered emotional support to Robert as he faced the prospect of losing his loyal companion. Over the following weeks, they developed a special routine. Whenever the weather allowed and Martha felt strong enough, Robert would pick her up by car and they'd go together to the reserve. They walked slowly to the bridge with Duke and Daisy following at their own pace. There, sitting on the central bench, they spent hours talking, reminiscing, watching the dogs explore the creek banks. They were precious moments, filled with a sharp awareness of life's fragility and beauty. Martha, having faced her own mortality during surgery, found a new appreciation for each day, every shared moment. Robert, in turn, processed his grief, in advance for Duke's eventual passing, finding comfort in Martha's presence and the silent understanding between them. The news about Duke's condition spread through the neighborhood, sparking an outpouring of affection for the dog everyone considered a local symbol. Children left special treats at Robert's gate. Elderly people would stop to pet Duke when they saw him passing by. The City Hall even issued a symbolic decree declaring Duke an honorary citizen of Asheville, recognizing his contribution to the community. Daisy, as if understanding the situation, became even more protective of Duke. She was often seen lying beside him, gently licking his ears or simply staying close, a constant, comforting presence. After 3 months of post-surgery recovery, Martha was fully discharged by her cardiologist. Her healing had been exemplary, surpassing even the most optimistic expectations of the medical team. "That's what I always say," Dr. Johnson remarked during the final checkup. "Medicine does its part, But the will to live, to be present for the people and things we love, is the best remedy. With her health restored, Martha threw herself into a new project, documenting Duke's story. She began by interviewing people in the community, gathering stories and memories about the impact the dog and the bridge had on their lives. Robert contributed photographs and excerpts from his personal journal, offering an intimate perspective of Duke's early days and the memories with Eleanor. The project turned into a book, initially conceived as just a personal record, but gradually growing in scope and ambition. A small local publisher took interest in the story, seeing potential to touch hearts far beyond Asheville. As the project progressed, Duke's health slowly declined. There were good days when he could still walk to the bridge and carry his symbolic stick. There were difficult days when he remained quiet in his favorite corner of Robert's garden, watching the world with tired but attentive eyes. The decision they had feared finally came on a spring morning, nearly 6 months after the diagnosis. Duke woke up struggling to breathe, refusing food and water. Dr. Reynolds called for an emergency home visit, confirmed what everyone already knew: it was time to say goodbye. The farewell took place in the most fitting location, Memory Bridge. With special permission from the vet, Robert carried Duke there one last time. Martha, Daisy, Jennifer, and a few close members of the community joined them, forming a circle of love around the dog who had touched so many lives. Even weakened, Duke seemed to gather one last burst of energy upon recognizing the place. With visible effort, he walked to the center of the bridge, where so many of his sticks had been placed over the years. There he lay down peacefully, gazing at the creek below as he had done so many times before. It was a quiet goodbye, filled with silent tears and shared memories. When it was over, Robert carried Duke back to the car, wrapped in his favorite blanket. The next morning, a special ceremony was held on the bridge. A small bronze plaque similar to the one honoring Eleanor was placed on the railing. For Duke, who taught us to build bridges between hearts. Daisy stayed by Robert's side throughout the ceremony, unusually quiet and solemn. As it ended and the attendees began to disperse, something extraordinary happened. The young dog slipped away, disappearing briefly into the bushes. When she returned, she carried a stick in her mouth. With determined steps, she walked to the center of the bridge and placed the stick exactly where Duke used to leave his. Then she sat down, looking at Robert and Martha as if to say, "The tradition continues." In that moment, amid the pain of loss, a crystal-clear understanding came over Martha. Life moves on its inevitable path, with its goodbyes and new beginnings. But some stories, the most important ones, the ones that touch the essence of what it means to be human, those never truly end. They remain alive in every person who hears them, in every heart that carries them forward, in every new twig added to the endless bridge of human memory. End of story. Do you also have a story of love and resilience tucked away in your heart? Share it in the comments and become part of this bridge of memories. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that make the soul smile.